Welcome to the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology podcast, where we interview the most interesting people in translational neuroscience.
Welcome to a new episode of the ECNP podcast series. Today we will talk about lived experience experts in research and how to move from tokenism to empowerment. My name is Annemiek van Berkel and I work as Project Manager Science at ECNP. And today we have a very special guest with us, Vanessa Pinfold, head of the McPin Foundation. Vanessa has a background in geography, obtaining her PhD degree from the University of Nottingham, but she has worked in mental health research for over 25 years. And in 2013, she established the McPin Foundation. The focus of the foundation is on putting expertise from experience at the heart of mental health research. Vanessa, a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Well, from a PhD in geography to founding the McPin Foundation, can you share your personal journey leading to this?
Yeah. When I went to university, in the first week in the block where I was studying, a lass took an overdose and we had to rush her to hospital. And that was the first time, I think, that I'd come up close to somebody who was thinking of taking their own life. The word suicide wasn't really part of my vocabulary aged 18. But as I grew up as a teenager, I had lots of periods of feeling very sad and crying lots. And looking back, that probably was a period of depression for me. But again, I didn't have the words to describe it. And it didn't progress to a point where I needed to seek treatment. So my journey in terms of with mental health has very much come from a strong conviction that it's a very stigmatised and discriminated set of conditions, poorly understood. And all the way through my degree doing geography, I intersected with issues around mental health that meant that I felt like it was going to be my cause. It was going to be something that I needed to put my efforts into, because I really couldn't understand how I'd got age 18 with all this massive level of education and going through university, and mental health just wasn't in the repertoire of people's conversations. So that's really where it started. In terms of McPin, so I did my degree in geography, and then I had the option to do 3 different things. I was going to go and be a teacher, but I decided I didn't really want to be a geography teacher, partly because my mum's a geography teacher and I didn't want to follow the footsteps of my mum. I also had, at the time, I was really interested in housing. I was worried about homelessness, and I applied to Salford to do a housing studies master's because I thought that maybe what I should do is try and address issues of inequality through housing. But I also got the opportunity to stay on at Nottingham and do a PhD, which is what I did. So I was a tutorial assistant. I stayed on for another 3 years and I did my PhD working in Nottingham at a time when a large psychiatric institution was being closed down and people were being moved out of the institution into various different places of residence. And my PhD was on something called looking at community connection. So following 25 people who were leaving hospital and following their narrative with them, describing what that change meant for them and how they were transitioning out of this very large institution into varying different places in the community. And in doing my PhD, I worked out very quickly that there was no way I could do my PhD effectively unless I understood schizophrenia a lot more than I did. So I started reading books. I went to the library. I still thought this is not going to take me to a place where I'm really going to understand what it's like to live with schizophrenia. So I went to a support group for families run by the National Schizophrenia Fellowship, and that group, which was mostly mums who were supporting sons, welcomed me with open arms. And I've always looked back on that time because I felt like an imposter going into a session where they were talking about all these very difficult things, and I was a student, curious about this thing called schizophrenia. But they welcomed me and they supported me, and I've just taken each of these kind of things that happened to me. I'd never forget them, and I kind of take them on my journey about why I do certain things. So their stories and the difficult struggles that they were experiencing at that time kind of stayed with me. And I also ended up befriending a gentleman. I realised that I needed to understand in a lot more personal way, rather than just, doing interviews in terms of research data, in terms of my PhD. I ended up becoming a befriender for somebody with schizophrenia. And I'm indebted again to them for opening my eyes to all the things that I would not have seen any other way. So that was kind of the early days of me being really interested in lived experience in people's journeys and trying to research with kindness and compassion, but getting much, much deeper into the issues than superficially just studying something. So from very early on, I felt like working very closely with lived experience expertise was really, really important. So it came from my PhD, and then I went on to work at King's College London, and then I went on to Rethink Mental Illness, a large mental health research charity. And I kind of took that instinct with me all the way. Every single research project I was involved in, I was thinking, how can we involve lived experience experts as part of the research team within this? How can I open up space within these studies? Because it just felt like it was it was vital in order to do better quality work, to do it in that way. And then in 2012, I had the opportunity to establish within the McPin Foundation a research unit because of some changes that were happening at the organisation that I was working in. And so we started McPin from a TUPE transfer process of 6 people and 3 projects from Rethink Mental Illness into McPin. And that has kind of formed the kind of starting point of the journey which we're on today, of really trying to centre lived experience expertise in all forms of different research. And my journey and my kind of inspiration and kind of, I suppose, my role is really to lead an organisation to a point when I don't need to lead it anymore and other people can lead. I suppose I've been carefully trying to think about, are we viable? Is there space in the world for this thing called McPin? Is it useful as an organisation, as a charity, to be really prioritising this kind of work? There are lots of other organisations that do things very similar. There's lots and lots of people that have come before us, individuals and organisations. So it's trying to find a space in mental health research for an organisation like McPin, and we'll get a point when that journey's done for me, and hopefully I can pass it on to somebody else. So it's a very personal thing to me, really. Yeah, we're still on the journey.
Well, thanks very much for sharing. Yeah, so before we talk a bit about the foundation and what it does, maybe you can share your view or your definition of lived experience expertise. What is it?
Yeah, I suppose the way we look at it at McPin is that lived experience in terms of mental health comes from living with mental distress, however that is described. So some people take a more diagnostic angle and talk about living with bipolar or living with psychosis or living with depression, anxiety. And other people understand their distress through a lens of trauma or life adversity. So at McPin, we don't come at it from any one kind of model, but basically people self-define. So when we advertise for jobs, particularly say we want people to be peer researchers or public and patient information officer, we ask people to bring their personal lived experience into the workplace, but we don't define what that needs to be. And I think that's a really important part of how we work. We also give choices for what labels people bring to that. So some person might say, I'm a peer researcher. Somebody else might say, I'm a service user researcher. Another person is, I'm a lived experience researcher. And somebody else will say, I'm a researcher. So we're really careful with how lived experience is brought into the workplace. But the underbelly of all of our work is the fact that people are bringing life experiences to the research table, and they're using them by combining them with a level of skill. So maybe that's research knowledge, it might be a PhD, it might be a master's, or it might be an interest in something. And they combine together the lived experience of poor mental health with the skills that you need to do a particular research task, whatever that might be, in an advisory group or as a researcher working in a qualitative research study. And the combination of those things is what we call lived experience expertise. It is the expertise that you get from combining this thing called lived experience with skills that you need in the workplace, because most of the work that we're doing is situated within a workplace, and you are there as a partner working alongside other people within a team to deliver what is sometimes quite complicated research. The other thing to emphasise about lived experience expertise is it's not just about mental health. And the more and more we work in this, it's about the intersectional level of different experiences. So gender, age, ethnicity, sexuality, lots and lots of different dimensions are relevant when we're thinking about bringing our lived experience into work. And again, people will choose what's relevant in what context and how comfortable or not they are about bringing aspects of their personal identity into the workplace. But sometimes people say, we've all got lived experience. And we do, but often in the research context, what we're trying to do is we're kind of tying in very, very relevant experience to a particular topic or a particular set of circumstances, and thinking that people working on the study have got something in their own life that is similar to this topic that we are researching.
Yeah. Clear, thanks. From your point of view, and I think you've already made it quite clear, but why is it so important that McPin is there and that all the other organizations? But can you...
I think it is really, really important that we've got organisations that are there to support this kind of work, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And as we said, lived experience expertise does require expertise, and expertise doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from somewhere. So having an organisation like ours that is there to advocate for it, to open spaces for more of it, to help people on their journey to develop the skills to do it well, to learn from others, to network, to bring other people into space, so that it can kind of balance against, or not against, but alongside other aspects of research communities. So what we don't want to be seen as this tiny little thing on the side that's like the added extra, the option. We want to see ourselves as absolutely central in the research landscape, alongside, say, research ethics and research governance, alongside building clinical research teams and the architecture and the infrastructure that goes into clinical trials units. They have been built, they are a thing. Lived experience expertise, again, is something that has to be carefully developed. It's not just going to happen by chance, and it's building on the work of people for the last 40 years that have been developing this in a sense as a discipline. And there are disciplines out there right across the world. You've got the Asylum magazine, you've got MAD studies, you've got survivor research led teams. These are really, really important parts of the lived experience landscape. Where we're very much into doing collaborative work, and we kind of nest lived experience within different research teams. We do a little bit of lived experience leadership work. We'd like to do a little bit more of that. But again, it's complementing all these different initiatives that are happening right across the globe that are championing this and centering it, which has got to a point now where a lot of funders are saying it's an absolute essential requirement. If you're going to do quality mental health research, you've got to have a strong patient and public involvement programme.
Can you tell a bit more about specific projects you've been working on for the last 10 years, or any projects that you're particularly proud of, or showcase really your mission?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different pieces of work. When I was at Rethink, the first project I commissioned was a study which was looking at drug use and poor mental health. And it was going to be funded by the Home Office, the UK Home Office. And immediately I said, I want to recruit a group of service user researchers to do that work. I want to recruit people who've got experience of substance use and poor mental health. That's how we're going to address this, because they wanted strong policy recommendations out of that piece of work. So I suppose it's guided me all the way through of thinking about how can we do this piece of work with an appropriate methodology whereby we really centre experts by experience as core members of the research team. So that's kind of one example of where, in particular, where it started. One of the first studies we did at McPin was a study which was looking at the experience of women who were taking antipsychotic medication and were pregnant. And there was a big database study where it was looking at merged data sets through primary care records and various different other sort of routine collected data sets. And it was looking at the risks and benefits of taking medication while pregnant. And we had a group of 4 women who were recruited both because they were women and they had experience of taking antipsychotic medication, and they were childbearing age. And they got together and they advised the research team on different aspects of the data, and we talked about the data sets and we looked at how the modelling was going to happen, because it was a large modelling project. And conversations were happening in that study about how to kind of weigh up the risks and the benefits. And the women said, you can't rank these. They're not like one thing's better than another. They're all horrific. They're all horrible. They're all things that we it's really, really challenging to manage this. So out of that came a conversation of maybe we should do a nested qualitative study looking at how women actually actively make that balancing decision that I'm pregnant, I'm on antipsychotic medication, do I stay on or do I come off? So that's what we did. We had 4 women that wrote the protocol, that developed the study. We went through the ethics process. They did 12 interviews. We analysed all the data, and a peer review paper came out the other end. And so I suppose that's an interesting example of where you had an advisory group, but then from that sparked this question that then led to another piece of research. And we tried to do some innovative dissemination around that as well, because within NICE guidelines, there was no guideline around what women should do. It's a dilemma. And so having some research which actually brought to the fore those dilemmas and actively encouraged clinicians to have more active conversations with women at an earlier stage was one of the key recommendations that came out of that, because it's very, very difficult to say what you should do, but you need to have conversations about it. So I'm really proud of that piece of work. Another piece of work we've just written a policy paper about it. It's called Partners 2 study, and it's a study looking at a intervention which was bridging secondary and primary care. So often we find people with severe mental illness fall between the gap. So they might be too well for secondary care, but they have got quite significant needs, and primary care doesn't always pick this up. So it's kind of like this gap patient group. So we developed a study which was looking at trying to fill the gap with a new post called a care partner. And over quite a few years, we co-developed the partners intervention with mental health service users and carers. We did lots of pilot work, we did lots of qualitative work, and people got involved in lots and lots of different activities through that. And out of the end, we did a big randomised control trial, a cluster randomised control trial, and then we try and implement the work in another couple of trusts as well, because it's all very well finding you could do something in place A and B, but what about C, D, E, F, G? So the whole that project was really interesting, because we were kind of following that whole pathway of feasibility, development, trial, and then implementation. And the interesting narrative there as well is because actually the trial showed that our intervention, it wasn't better than the control condition. But intuitively, it made a lot of sense. And the qualitative work showed that there was some really key active ingredients within that. So we did try and implement it in a couple of other places, and we have written up our findings. So I think what's really important is sometimes research doesn't find the magic. It works. And having people alongside you as advisors all the way along championing it, but also helping to hold you to account, is a really, really helpful part of that process, particularly when things don't go right or don't go particularly well, because it's really easy to lose focus. But the more you turn and think about why you're doing it, and having people holding to account because it's their lives, it's their family's experience, it kind of creates a different culture within a project. And I think the clinicians working on the study, the people working from a lived experience perspective, and the researchers all have a very, very different experience as a study team when you put co-production and lived experience work at the heart of a study. It leads to a kind of a different kind of research environment, and one personally that I found really, really rewarding. And I've made friends along the way, and there have been difficult moments, and we've lost people, but it's all part of that journey and that commitment to try and ensure that we always remember those that came on that journey with us and brought their expertise to the table. But there's lots of examples that I can share, but that's a few.
Well, thanks for sharing these very inspiring examples. But I think, however, if we look broader, current lived experience involvement is often considered still as tokenism, or often. What is your point of view on that? What's the current status?
It does depend. I think that you can find some amazing studies where lived experience is really centred. It might be led. We have studies where people working from lived experience perspective are the chief investigator, and all the staff working on it are working from a lived experience perspective. So in some senses, you do have studies where that is acknowledged and that is funded, and those are really, really key pieces of work. But they obviously, if we think about the whole of the research, mental health research across the globe, they're a tiny, 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 tiny proportion of what we've got invested in. And the important thing is about knowledge creation and how to do knowledge creation and the importance of knowledge creation. So I think that on the other end of the spectrum, you've got studies where the funder wants you to bring lived experience experts, patients and the public into your study. And you think, okay, quick way to do that is I'll form a group, I'll run a workshop, thanks very much, and I'm going to carry on doing whatever I was going to do. Or you're doing, say, lab-based work, and you're thinking, how am I going to bring lived experience into this kind of work? It's really, really technical, not really sure how to do it. I'm going to have some conversations with people in my clinic. So I have some conversations with people in my clinic about some ideas I've got. I've done the PPI stuff, and then I'm going to carry on with my 3-year trial, and I don't need to worry about it anymore because I did a little bit of early PPI. So I think the difficulty we have is that we need to move to ensure that if we're going to do PPI well, we need to acknowledge there are some standards. And standards have been written. The National Institute of Health Research in the UK has got PPI, good practice standards, and it's got guidelines for co-production. But they still need interpretation. And I suppose what I would say as standards around quality, patient and public involvement is that it needs to have longevity. So if we think about sharing influence, which means sharing power and also means sharing resource. So you've got to open up the roles within your team, within your project. You've got to be thinking about how you invest long term. So not one-off workshops, but build a group that are going to be on this journey with you maybe for the next 3 years. How are you going to resource that? How are you going to skill it up? How are you going to manage it? How do you skill up other people in the team to be on board with this? Working in this way does require the whole team to have an understanding about what patient and public involvement is, or lived experience leadership is. It is a discipline, so it does require people to put energy into understanding how to do it well. I often say you learn by doing. So the thing is, we just say try. There are barriers. Time's a barrier, budget's a barrier, skills are a barrier, but none of those are insurmountable. Plan a strategy, reach out to people that can help you. There's guidance out there. Start small and build it, but build for the long term. So the tokenism comes from, as I said, where people are just ask somebody in their clinic, or they form a group and it's only at the beginning, or they have a group that only meets once a year. You need to be able to think about how this work is given a status, and you are sharing this thing called knowledge creation. You are sharing that with other people, and their expertise is, you're opening up your project so their expertise can filter in and make a difference. This is not something on the side. This is about integrating the expertise that comes from lived experience into the science, whether that is through developing new information sheet, whether it's thinking about recruitment in a different way, whether it's thinking about the battery of measures that you use and actually prioritise them in a different way because people will experience them differently if you order them differently, whether it's about the interpretation of data, whether it's about standing in conferences, writing blogs, developing toolkits. Having the expertise from experience as part of the team in all of those things is really, really important for mental health science. And if you minimise it because you don't plan it early, you don't create a budget, and you're always thinking about I don't know how it's going to make a difference, that's tokenism. So it's about turning it on a head and really thinking about opening up our projects to lived experience expertise.
Nice, thanks. Yeah, so my next question was indeed what are practical ways? But I think indeed you're already sharing so many practical tips and best practices, and maybe we can elaborate a bit more on that. Very practical best practice side. Our audience is mainly researchers. How can they start? Start small, but how?
Well, I think it's opening up spaces in your groups, in your departments, bringing people who want to work from a lived experience perspective in research into the team, into the department, probably building panels. So lived experience advisory panels or advisory groups, clinical academic groups. You can do it, running seminar series and various different activities that you've got going on in your department. Invite people with lived experience from different communities into your spaces. One of the key things really is going out into the community and spreading the word that you're doing this kind of work. So one of the challenges we have around tokenism as well is when it's always the same people. So for a long time, PPI work was seen as very female, white, middle-class activity. And obviously that's not great and isn't what we need going forward, because we need our teams to look a lot more like the populations of which we are working within. So I live in London, and if we think about the diversity of the population of London, we're actively thinking about how our workforce and also our PPI groups much more represent in terms of particularly marginalised communities, but also experiences of class, of gender, and a whole raft of multi-morbidities. How does that mix? How do you make sure you bring that mix and that expertise into your studies so that, because tokenism can also be seen that it's just the same people all the time doing something and it becomes quite elitist. At the same time, that doesn't mean there isn't a space for people that have worked for many, many years in this area, but it's about trying to open up and diversify and bring different voices into PPI work.
But how do you approach?
Yeah.
So one
of the practical things is about doing more outreach work. So if we sit in our organisation and send out newsletters through our networks or put adverts on Twitter. We're only going to reach the people we're already reaching. So one of the key things in this kind of work is it's really, really important to think, okay, where might I be able to build new partnerships? So one of the key things for researchers is, if you're starting a new study, think, is there a local group that we've got? It might be a carer or a peer support group. It might be a local organisation that, I don't know, does work with young kids that have been bereaved, or it could be a support group for people who have experienced homelessness, or whatever it might be. So if you go and reach out to different organisations and have those conversations, even before you've fully formulated your research idea, it can be really helpful if you resource them appropriately to try and bring them into your research project. So I think one of the key things for researchers is start your partnerships early, work out where within your local community. So recently we've been doing some work with some people in Wales, and I said, have you got networks locally? And if you haven't, can you start developing early conversations like with Mind Cymru, and go and visit them, give talks, you give to them and they might give back to you. So the whole point about reciprocity is really important. So the other risk that we have is that we extract and make our research all this rich with all the expertise, but what have we done to give back? So I always think about reciprocity in all of this. So think about how we can help community groups, and community groups can help us. So basically one of the key things is, the starting point is to work out where your partnerships might be. Some people reach out to organisations like us and other organisations like us, but it's also really important to go much further into grassroots organisations, I would say, and try and think about whether you can build partnerships there. It's also around trying to open up opportunities for people who might be in, say, recovery colleges, or, in different kind of support groups. So it's about reaching out to people who might not immediately think research is something I want to do, but actually with a little bit of encouragement and with the opportunities made simpler and less grand, as it were, in terms of research science, and broken down, it can inspire people to get involved that think, actually, maybe involvement in research could be quite interesting, quite useful. I'm quite motivated and want to do that. So the first thing is being really proactive, trying to build a group of people that you can work with. The second thing is getting the money to do so, and the time. So you need resource, you need to be able to pay people, and you need to put the time into building a relationship. So lived experience involvement work is relational, all about relationships. And sometimes things work really well and some things don't work so well. And it often comes down to poor communication, or not setting expectations, or whatever it might be. But there are often relational issues why things go a little bit awry. So it's really important to put the time into that. And the other thing is, so I'm building safe spaces, trying to build the kind of environment where people are willing and able to come and work with you, which might mean not working in a building with a locked door, for example. So one of the studies I worked on, we were used to be working in a primary care GP practice, but you had to have a lanyard and you had to have all these fobs to get up into the room. It just felt like too many barriers for people. So we hired the local community centre and went across the road to have lunch in the community cafe. And that completely transformed the project from being something that was really difficult for people to engage with to something that they had made the suggestions, they found the venue, and it was their space. And sort of the professionals were coming into a space where people with lived experience felt most comfortable, rather than the other way around. So it's doing small things like that can really change practices.
Thanks. And in your opinion, what are common obstacles or roadblocks for really to move forward, and what's your opinion on strategies to overcome?
I suppose there's a few things. There's attitudinal roadblocks where people some researchers have difficulty with this kind of work. They might feel it affects the equipoise of a study. They might think that people with lived experience have got particular biases that are not going to be helpful for them in their science. There are researchers that can't see the possibilities. So one of the roadblocks can be attitudinal. Another roadblock I think I've mentioned is time. It does take time to do this well, and the resourcing, the budgeting that is required. And I think sometimes people don't put enough time and budget into this kind of activity. So they write a grant and they work out what they're going to do for PPI, and they allocate the money. And then when they get into it, they realise they actually need quite a lot more and haven't got that. So it can become a little bit tricky. So that's the second barrier. The other part of it is the pace of research and the ebb and flow of research. Is that sometimes what happens is there's a huge amount of activity at the very beginning. So you build a lived experience advisory group, for example, and you've got a 3-year study, and people get together and they help to shape the protocol, and they help looking at all the research ethics committee documentation, so consent forms, information sheets, and all the kind of things that we're going to do to recruit people. There's really a focus of activity. And then it goes into the trial, and it's like everyone's beavering away in the trial, and there can be a lull for people working in the groups. And so it's really, really important to keep up the communication and to actively think about how the group can help you problem solve, think about different activities they can do along the way. And then at the end, there can be another hive of activity when you want everybody to pop up again and start disseminating. So I think the other barrier to this work is to have consistency and to think about planning so that people can maintain their active involvement all the way throughout. The other thing is thinking about how you can introduce lived experience researchers into your teams. So if you're doing some qualitative research, you can employ peer researchers as part of the team or co-researchers as part of the team. So I think that it's really, really important to think about opening up different kind of roles within the team for people working from a lived experience perspective. So that's one of the other key things. Not really recognising that this is kind of a specific kind of work. So the skill building of teams is really, really important. And there are training programs that people can go on now to learn more about how to do PPI. I suppose from my perspective, there's no one way you do it, but there are some really core principles. So working with others and sharing examples with other researchers is another way of upskilling yourself and feeling confident in this kind of work. So it is important to get training.
I have a background in basic preclinical research, working very much on cellular mechanisms of brain conditions. So for many basic researchers, lived experience expertise feels quite far away, as you already said, like it's very technical. Like, do you have specific tips for basic researchers or preclinical research?
One of my ideas, I think, is to try and, as groups of basic scientists, bring together people with lived experience that are interested in basic science. There are people out there that are really actively interested in basic science, what is showing, what might come next. Bring together discussion groups, have workshops, invite people into the spaces in which you're working so they can become excited about the work that you're doing, and that excitement is infectious. So one thing is just building a community of people who are interested in basic science and not closing the door on people with lived experience because it's seen as so technical, but open up that space and invite people in. The other thing which I know is happening, there's a group in Australia that are doing amazing work whereby at the start of a project, they call them Plex, but a person with lived experience interviews the scientist about the idea, and they do a little podcast on a video. And then in the middle of the study, they catch up and find out what's happening and share some early results. And at the end of it, they do another interview and they disseminate the findings. And what this is doing is surfacing this dialogue between the clinician, researcher, and people with lived experience that are actively invested in this whole research project, and bringing that dialogue to the fore. But actually some of the kind of things that happen within the project might even change as a result of some of these different conversations. So that's another example of, I think, some really important work. Groups, I think it would be great if a group of neuroscientists could get together and run a network for people working for a lived experience perspective that are interested in neuroscience, might like to become neuroscientists, that again can discuss like latest advances in neuroscience, and together they can write about it. If people are working in labs, I've always thought, wouldn't it be great if people working in labs can meet people in the community? So whatever it is, whatever disorder in inverted commas people are studying, you can personalise it a lot more. Now, obviously, that might happen ordinarily, but in my experience, it doesn't. So it's about trying to set up like some mentoring programs and this interaction. So the more interaction that we can have, I think, with the basic science community, meeting different community groups. Something that is also important is people working from a lived experience perspective. For many people, there's an activism element to this. So I think that it's important to be able to bring into space the activism dialogue. And so if you can open up spaces with basic scientists, lived experience experts, etc., and having these kind of conversations, sometimes they're difficult conversations. Some of the difficult conversations is data use or ethical questions that might be going on, that if we're finding out this, what might that mean, further down the line? So having these early conversations that might lead to key ethical challenges for us from emerging science, because often science has unintended consequences, doesn't it? So it's important to try and think through these things really early on. So those are just a few ideas, but obviously this is my passion, but it feels that there's so many reasons to open up the dialogue and open up spaces in our projects. We might not have all the answers yet, but we could be on a journey together to find them. And it just feels like it definitely is an additive element rather than it's taking anything away if it's done in a careful and considered and a methodical way. And I think that's the key thing about science. It's about building the method. And for me, patient and public involvement is part of method. So you build it carefully, you build in checks and balances, you build in work to support people with the emotional labour that's involved, and you write about it so that other people can learn from what you've tried.
So as we're wrapping up, what message or key takeaway would you like to give our listeners regarding empowerment of lived experience involvement?
I suppose the message is, please start designing studies that include patient and public involvement as a key aspect of the design, whatever your study. If you're working in mental health science, think PPI, think diversity, think intersectionality, but bring in lived experience expertise into your studies, into your teams, into your groups, into your laboratories. Then tell us about it.
Many thanks, Vanessa. I think very inspiring. We talked about your personal journey, about tokenism, about best practice tips. And I think we were leaving a lot to our listeners on how they can move ahead. You also recently published some guidelines, right? So maybe we can put that in the show notes. That's also for listeners too.
Because McPin has been 10 years old, trying to build on the knowledge of the whole organisation and the many, many people. I counted 85 members of staff that have worked with us over the last 10 years, sharing their expertise and coming on this journey with us. What we tried to do is this thing called 10 for 10, so 10 resources for 10 years. And each of them are, they're not how-to guides, but they're kind of our shared learning of what we found around patient and public involvement, co-research, peer research, using lived experience in the workplace, and a whole raft of other areas as well. We've got a podcast on mentoring. We've got a resource thinking about wellbeing in the workplace. We've got a guide on how to run meetings with young people. So check out our website in the 10 for 10 programs page, and you'll be able to download all of those resources.
Many, many, many thanks. Also, thanks to our listeners for tuning in. And of course, we welcome you to our future episodes.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the interviewee and not necessarily the official position of the ECNP. And of course, this should not be the basis for clinical treatment decisions.